The Sega Genesis, perhaps the greatest gaming console of the 90s. But that depends on who you ask. The Sega Genesis, or as it's known in Japan and some other countries, the Sega Mega Drive, was released on October 29, 1988, followed by a North American release on August 14, 1989. At the time of its release, there really wasn't much competition for the Sega Genesis, as it was only one of very few 16-bit consoles that were available at the time. Only one game console actually stood in the Sega Sega Genesis. Only one stood in its way, and that was the Nintendo Entertainment System, an 8-bit system that was released several years before in North America in 1985. One game that Sega had hoped to cash in on was a little game that they thought could compete with Mario. That game was Alex Kidd in the Enchanted Castle, which was a launch title for the Sega Genesis in North America. While Alex Kidd did feel very Mario-like in a way, it wasn't that game that, let's say, gripped the attention of Sega Genesis gamers at the time. That honor goes to Altered Beast, another Sega Genesis launch title which was based on an arcade game, as many of you may have known. A little over 2 years after the Sega Genesis was released in North America, another game console came along that, well, let's just say that it had some competition for once. In late 1991, the release of the Super Nintendo was either a good thing or a bad thing for Sega fans around the world, and that's debatable, but we can agree on one thing, that it started the very first console wars. In mid-1991, shortly before the release of the Super Nintendo, we got the defining game, the so-called killer app of the Sega Genesis, which was, well, you've seen it on the screen for about 15 seconds, it's Sonic the Hedgehog. Fast forward to late 1992, and we got the release of the Sega CD, or the Sega Mega CD as it was known in some countries. The Sega CD was considered revolutionary for its time, but it took a while to adopt. There were quite a few people that were interested in it, but it slowly died off as it gained ground into the mid-90s, which we'll talk about the Sega CD in another episode. In 1993, the Sega Genesis Model 2 was introduced, which was a smaller, more lightweight version of the bulkier Sega Genesis that was released in 1989. And then there's the infamous Sega Genesis Model 3, which really wasn't made by Sega at all. It was made by Majesco, which that we should probably save for an episode all by itself. And sometime after the release of the Sega Genesis Model 2, but before the release of the Model 3, we got the very infamous 32X, which that will probably have an episode by itself alone. Now, we can go on all day about the other versions of the Sega Genesis, such as the Sega Nomad and a couple of the others, but I have decided to make those separate episodes, so those we'll discuss in the future. And then sometime around 2009, a company called AtGames decided they were going to revive the Sega Genesis. The good thing about it is it could play most of your Sega Genesis cartridges, and it had built-in games. The downside was you couldn't use your additional accessories such as the Sega CD or the 32X, which you couldn't use those anyway if you had a Model 3, which that's pretty much what it is. It's a smarter, if you could call it that, a smarter version of the Sega Genesis Model 3. While this game system has sold pretty well over the years, and I believe it was just recently discontinued as of 2019, gamers really don't care much for it, as it seems to have a bit of a bad reputation, which, as you've heard me say in the past few minutes, it's going to have its own episode just to explain it. As this video is just pretty much a brief history, if you didn't already tell. That's why you clicked on it, right? Tell me that's why you clicked on it. Like I said at the beginning, Sega Genesis you could consider one of the greatest consoles ever made, or the greatest console of the 90s. But that depends on if you ask a Nintendo fan. Like I said at the beginning, it all depends on who you ask.